I just want to thank everybody for being here, and I'm really honored to be here. It's such a beautiful space, and I want to thank everybody at the church who made this happen. And I'm going to turn it over to Dana Kennedy, who's really in charge.
No pressure there, though. Yeah. It's not a problem. Well, you know, Isabel and I know each other because we work at the New York Post together, right across. In fact, our desks are right across. And there's certain things I know about her, and there's certain things I know about the book. But what I really don't know, and what I'd like to start off with, is asking her, I know how hard she works at the New York Post. We don't get the credibility of the New York Times, and we work about 10,000 times harder. So to do a book like this required an incredible amount of research, and Isabel's going to tell us about what she did. But I first want to find out what about these two women, Ida and Louise Cook, that weren't sexy women. They weren't hot, sexy, whatever. We don't know if they were spies or not. We'll get to that. What made you stop everything in your otherwise really busy life and take this huge responsibility on of telling their story?
Well, first of all, I felt very privileged to be able to tell their story. When I first heard about Ida and Louise, who were really opera groupies, they became opera fans in the 1920s and the 30s. They were civil servant typists in the law courts in London. They couldn't afford to go to Covent Garden, so they would line up to get the cheap seats. And made friends somehow with Hitler's favorite conductor, and he asks them to help him save Jewish musicians and scholars, and they do. And I thought, how did these two women get lost to history? Because what they did was really courageous, although they didn't really think it through. When they were asked to do something, they just did it, which is sort of the beauty of this book. But you mentioned that they weren't glamorous. Had they probably been more glamorous, we would know their story today. But precisely because they were plain and they sort of blended in everywhere and nobody really gave them a second look, that was why they were able to do what they did. And they saved 29 people by being sort of unobtrusive. So I was fascinated by these ordinary, extraordinary women. And actually, I got a lot of flack at the beginning because my previous publisher said, there's no way you can tell this story because the older sister, Louise, she destroyed all of the documentation after the war. So she destroyed the letters and all of the documents of the people they'd saved. And I thought, well, working at the Post, there's always a way to tell a story if you want to tell it badly enough. And so, but I didn't realize that that would take me on a 5-year journey to archives all over the world in order to tell this story.
What really struck me, and what I'd love you to sort of explain a little bit, is again, these, to use a really mean term, they were two nobodies, and they didn't have the benefit of like husbands and beauty behind them. But they came from a very, very modest family. But it was like almost overnight. Yes, they liked opera, which was sort of a recent. They didn't grow up loving opera. They liked opera, but they went from being these two English girls who liked opera to like making friends with one of the biggest divas, Curci, what's the name of it?
Amelita Galli-Curci.
And then they're coming and they're saving their shillings, pfennigs, whatever you want to call them, to then come to New York and hang out with this diva and then go to her Catskills Mountains estate. How did they affect all this so quickly?
Well, that was part of the reason they're so great. When they became opera fans, they went to see Amelita Galli-Curci, who was a great opera star of the 20s and the 30s, when she came to England. And they waited backstage and they said, we'd really love to hear you sing opera, because she was doing a song cycle. And they said, where do you sing opera? And she said, I sing opera only at the Metropolitan in New York. And so Ida Cook says, I don't know how old she was at the time, 23. She said, well, we're going to New York. This was 1924, at a time when, going to New York was like going to the moon for Ida and Louise Cook. So what they did, it took them 2 years to save their money. They walked to work, they didn't eat lunch, and they put it all away. They saved 100 pounds each, and then they took this ship to New York, and they talked to people on the boat, obviously, about what they had done, and everybody was so fascinated. Oh, and Amelita Galli-Curci said, if you make it to New York, I will give you tickets to all of my operas. So they get there, and then the New York Times does a story upon them the day they arrive.
That was crazy
and
too.
And it was
yeah.
like, it was the funniest story because they get into their hotel room and they get a call from somebody at the Times, and the first thing they ask is their hair color. So the story is really funny when you read it today because the lead of the story is Ida and Louise Cook, members of the working girl class in London, comma, blonde, comma. I mean, that just struck me as, was of its time. But so they had this perseverance about them, like nothing was going to defeat them.
That sounds familiar, Isabel, just like you.
That's funny.
It's true.
No, but they weren't going to be defeated. And when somebody said, "Oh, I need your help to get these Jews out of the Third Reich," and they were like, "Well, we've never met a Jew. What's the problem?" And they only realized the problem when they went to Frankfurt and they saw what was going on with the Nuremberg laws. And those were the laws that gradually disenfranchised Jews. If you were Jewish in 1938, you no longer could have a business. You couldn't be seen by an Aryan nurse if you were in a hospital. All these things were sort of outrageous to Ida and Louise, who sort of look to each other and say, but what about the law? And what about jurisprudence? And what about all those things? And it's like, it didn't apply to Jews. So once they figured that out, they figured out how to save people. And that was a whole learning curve.
One thing that I found really interesting about the book is there's, in a way, parallel stories of these two unbelievable women, and then the backdrop of what happened in World War II. And what struck me, like in 1934, when they were beginning this whole, going to Germany and Austria, there was an assassination of someone named Dollfuss. What's his first name, Isabel?
The chancellor, yeah.
Right, the Austrian chancellor. And I just, considering what's going on in our lives now with the potential threat of nuclear war and everything that's been so crazy in our lives, and we were just talking actually about Ukraine before we came here in a whole different conversation. But it says, like, for the Cook sisters, the Dollfuss assassination would prove a jolt of sorts to their happy lives. Quote, the first international event whose repercussions deeply affected our private affairs, recalled Ida. I blush now to think how ignorant we were of the significance of this event. And I would love you to speak to the fact that people were sort of in denial a little bit about what was going on. And I sometimes wonder if we're in a little bit denial now, what's going on, the potential of what's happening in Europe and Ukraine and Russia.
I think so too, but that's one of my favorite parts of the book, because you have this, terrible event. The Chancellor of Austria is assassinated by Nazis. It's 1934. Ida and Louise Cook are making their way to Salzburg for the festival, and they really want to go. So they go to the travel agent. I don't know if you remember Cook's Travel. Okay, so Ida's on a train. Ida's on a train, and she speaks to a German family on the train, and they said, there's no way you're going to be able to cross the border into Austria. It's like, it's a real mess. And Ida just turns to him and says, well, the man from Cook said we'd be able to get through, so we're going to be able to get through.
It's so British, too, isn't it?
It really is.
It's so British.
It really is, and I love that point of view. And, you see them, you sort of see them come to realization of what's really going on behind their love of opera and their single-minded pursuit of opera.
Something else that I was really sort of puzzled, interested by, I'm sure historians know this, but it talks about, Hitler, he was obviously, we didn't know how bad an actor he was at this point, but it talks here about, Hitler engaged in his own music world sabotage. And you go on to say about how opera was such a symbol for the Nazis and for Hitler, and I don't understand that. Can you explain that?
Well, Hitler in Mein Kampf talks about one of the transcendental experiences of his life was going to the opera at 14, and he never forgot it. And certainly he used, especially Wagner, as to show the greatness of the German Reich, and he certainly used it for propaganda purposes. The Cooks were just enmeshed in this fantasy world. I mean, their lives, you spoke earlier about the fact that they weren't married. They lived for opera. They lived in that fantasy world. And Ida later became a novelist. She wrote romance novels. And she wrote like 200 romance novels in her life under the name Mary Burchell. And those first novels, she used the royalties to help save. She used the royalties as guarantees to bring people from the Third Reich into England. But they lived in this world of fantasy. And I think that, I don't know if this is the question you asked, but you asked about the importance of opera. But for them, certainly that was the importance of opera. And for Hitler, too. I mean, it's a good question, because it was through this world of fantasy that Germany was, coming back from the, what had happened during the First World War, and certainly the Treaty of Versailles and everything else. They were going to build themselves up to be the great Reich again. And Munich was really the capital of that. And the reason I say that Clemens Krauss, who prevailed upon the Cooks to help him save Jews, he was Hitler's favorite conductor, because Hitler put him in charge of the Bavarian Opera in Munich, which was really the crown jewel of the Nazis' cultural world.
I know. I was really struck by how these two, again, just happened to meet the top of the top conductors, the top divas with, in our world now we can like DM people on social media and get to them that way. But back then there was no easy way. You had to actually go there in person. Now, the title of the book is These Two Sisters' Daring Plan That Saved Opera's Jewish Stars. And, their daring plan was really, in a way, the actual nitty-gritty of it was them smuggling out the jewels and the furs that the Jews could not take with them. And I love some of the, first of all, they launched into what they called their Nervous British Spinster Act.
Those were their words, not mine.
Right, yeah, quote, their Nervous British Spinster Act, and insist quite simply that we always took our valuables with us because we didn't trust anyone with whom they could leave them at home. So that was sort of their cover story. And it said it started with jewelry and furs and anything they themselves could wear across an international border. And in the months leading up to the Second World War, Ida would describe the sisters' quote, bosoms quivering with smuggled jewels. Okay, that part is interesting, but what is a little scary is they say their big fear, and I can imagine, became the Black Guard, as Ida referred to them, the SS guards who would suddenly board the trains at frontier checkpoints to crack down against smuggling. Quote, we were a little frightened, Ida said. Typical, again, British understatement.
Yeah. I mean, it's really incredible when you think about it that they just wore the jewelry and the furs in plain sight, and they figured that set against their Marks and Spencer dresses and their Woolworths dresses, the border guards would just think it was fake. And they got away with it again and again and again. I mean, that's a lot of chutzpah. But the other thing, because if you were a Jew in 1938 and just before the war in 1939, you couldn't leave with anything. I mean, you had to surrender everything if you wanted to leave. You were allowed 14 Reichsmarks. One of the most brilliant things that they did, and I couldn't believe it when I found it, was they actually laundered money through opera tickets. And there was a letter in the Munich archives in which Ida asks Clemens Krauss's secretary to please, could you reserve 80 tickets for the next performance of whatever the opera was? And I'm like, 80 tickets? What do they want 80 tickets for? And it turns out what they would do is they would bring their little groups of, opera fans to Munich, and then they would get the would-be refugees to pay for everything, to pay for the opera tickets, to pay for the lodging. And the refugees would only get their money once they got to England. So think about it. They're moving assets across a border without any money actually being moved. It was genius. And I'm thinking these two, 30-something women just figured this out. And I guess when you're confronted with desperate times, maybe we would figure that out too, Dana.
Well, this is a small thing, but it really struck me because, so much of making something happen is paying attention to detail. And it was like this is what I never could have imagined. It said the furs they were smuggling out could have tripped them up, because apparently, who knew? This says there's nothing looks newer than a new label and an old coat. And this is what Louise Cook is. This is a direct quote from Louise Cook saying this. So we went around London appealing to well-dressed women to rip labels out of their coats. And once they caught on, it was quite a fad. We used to go direct from the airport or train station to the home of the prospective refugee. There we would rip off the German labels, sew in the London ones, pin on the jewelry, stuff our suitcases, and go on to the next hotel. But, I almost wonder, too, is, in a way they didn't have any credibility back then, because they weren't these days women can get an education, have big jobs. But it didn't mean that women weren't really smart back then. That They had no status in the real world, so they seemed to be they probably were just really, really smart women that would be like lawyers or journalists today, or doctors or anything, right?
Right, and Ida was a very prolific writer. But the greatness of that is the other thing that they thought through was, we're not going to take earrings for pierced ears because we don't have pierced ears. So they had to leave the earrings for pierced ears behind, and they would only take the clip-ons, which, I thought, you're right, a level of detail where they thought everything through, because, anything could have tripped them up and they would have gone to jail for smuggling.
And they also, which I thought was incredible, they got their own pied-à-terre in London, in a place called Dolphin Square, which sounds like sort of a, kind of almost a high-rise type thing in New York City, where people would live, and that became sort of the Underground Railroad for these people. It was another thing, because there wasn't really anybody giving them advice, right? Wasn't it just the two of them?
It was just the two of them. So they lived with their parents their whole lives, and I should back up a little bit. We're talking about a time in England when how many millions of men were killed in World War I? So there are actually studies done about how there were so many more women in the UK than there were men. So a lot of women just didn't get married. I mean, Ida and Louise kind of talked about it and said that they didn't feel like starting a family. I don't know about their sort of intimate lives. They never mention it. It's never mentioned in any of the correspondence, but I just think they sort of lived for opera and were very close to each other. So they rent this apartment in Dolphin Square once Ida starts to make money as a romance writer. And the apartment, the reason behind the apartment is this is where they're going to hold their opera soirees. It's where they're going to invite the people who stand with them in line at Covent Garden, to play records, essentially, and to have little parties. But when they start bringing the refugees over, that becomes the place that they deposit their refugees, because they had nowhere to live. At one point, one of the refugees writes that there were 15 people in that one-bedroom apartment who stayed there during, the worst of the war. So when I saw that they had a place there, I immediately thought, oh, I wonder if they're spies. And that's something we talked about at the beginning, because a lot of the MI6 people, because this was so close to, this was in Pimlico in central London, where all of the, the government offices were, and the head of MI6 had an apartment there. You also had Oswald Mosley living there, the British fascist, and I was like, well, why are Ida and Louise there? The Free French took up residence there at one point, so it was a very convenient place, and I thought, well, what are they doing there? But I couldn't find any real evidence that they were working for the government.
But we don't know that they weren't. Right?
That's true, too.
And because the New Yorker had a piece, and it was a couple of years ago, right? And it mentioned the potential movie that may or may not be coming. I hope it is. And Isabel's work. And I believe that the producer felt very confident that there were some CIA files. But how if you had nothing but the next 10 years to work on this, if you were still working on it, do you think you'd find, what's your gut tell you? Were they spies or not?
So I talked to people who knew them, who are... And they just thought that the spy thing couldn't be true, that it was just Ida and Louise getting together, force of will, doing what they needed to do.
Best kind of spies.
Right. And then, but then you look a little closer, and the people they were meeting in Berlin, like underground in Berlin, there's another couple of sisters that they do work with. they were members of the German resistance to Hitler. So, I mean, is that a spy? And then you've got Louise, the older sister, who's the great bureaucrat, teaching herself German at lightning speed so that they could do the refugee work. I mean, when I saw that, in combination with the place at Dolphin Square and all the other interesting characters who lived there, I'm like, what's going on there? So maybe if I devoted the rest of my life to it, I could find a document.
But speaking of devoting your life, tell us how, before we get to sort of maybe the things that are interesting at the end of it, how did you do this? It was 5 years of research. What countries did you go to, and how did you figure out where to go, and how helpful or not helpful were the people that you ran into?
Okay, so 5 years goes by quickly. I started off in London at the Victoria and Albert Archives, which is where Ida and Louise's papers are, what remains of their papers. There wasn't a lot of stuff. There were a lot of opera programs from all of their travels. There were records. There were letters from Amelita Galli-Curci, from Elizabeth Rethberg, from Ezio Pinza, all great opera stars of their day, but there was nothing really written by them. So I just started researching blindly, and I saw that Ida was friends with Rosa Poncell, another great diva, American opera star of the Met of the 30s and the 40s. And I thought, gee, there must be Rosa Poncell papers somewhere. And I just Googled Rosa Poncell papers. They were at the New York Public Library at the Performing Arts Center. And I walk in, and there's a huge file of letters from Ida Cook to Rosa Poncell, in which Ida details everything. She was a great letter writer. And then she was also friends with Ezio Pinza, who was another great opera singer at the Met. So there were letters that she wrote to him. There were letters that she wrote to Tito Gobbi, another Italian opera star, and there's a foundation in Rome, and I called them up, and the foundation's run by Tito Gobbi's daughter, and she said, yes, I remember Ida and Louise Cook. We have a big file of letters that she wrote to my parents. But probably the most important finds were at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. I was the first one to access their file because they were made righteous among the nations in 1964 at about the same time that Oskar Schindler and Raoul Wallenberg are given the distinction, and among the first women, but you've never heard of them. And so when I saw that file, and the file contained letters to Yad Vashem from a lot of their refugees and detailing exactly what Ida and Louise Cook had done and their trajectories, how they'd gotten out of Austria and out of Germany. So that was very helpful. And then I had a great sort of piece of luck when I discovered Ida's screenplay. So she had made friends somehow with Laurence Olivier and Josh Logan.
Again, how is this possible? I don't get it.
And so Josh Logan was the great producer, director of South Pacific, for example. That was one of his films and one of his Broadway plays. And he approached them and said, oh, I'd love to do a film about you. And so Ida, being the writer, says, I'm going to write the treatment. And there are letters in the Library of Congress where Josh Logan's papers are, in which Ida sort of bristles at what Hollywood wanted her to do, which was to make up a fake story, a fake romance about what the sisters had gone through. So Ida decides she's going to write her own screenplay. And okay, this was very useful to me because in the brackets in the screenplay, she would write something and then she would say, this really happened. And this conversation really happened. So I was able to use that for my book. But the screenplay was not that great, and I can see why somebody like Josh Logan didn't want to produce it. And I mean, the opening line of the screenplay written by Ida is, this is the story of two squares. And then it just goes, because that's what they thought of themselves. I mean, they were incredibly self-effacing, pretty modest. I mean, Ida was not so modest. I mean, she had this whole lecture tour across England in which she talked about what she did. She called it, the lecture tour was called Two Against Hitler, which was my original title for the book, but the marketing people at the publishing house were not into that. So it's Overture of Hope, which is okay. I'm okay with it now. But I don't know if I answered your question.
I think you did. Something that just kind of just affected me, so I'm going to ask about it. And I know on one hand we've seen so many books and films about the Holocaust and all that, but there was a passage in here, because part of it was seeing these two English women that could not believe this was happening. And I keep coming back to that idea. They can't believe this kind of evil is happening. And they see, I believe they are somewhere in Austria or whatever, and they're looking at all these people down below just carrying what they call bundles. They only ever had bundles. Yeah. Can you talk about what you think what effect it had on them, besides helping? Any great stories like a hero's journey and how they're changed by the end. How do you think that they were affected and changed?
So the scene you're talking about is in a train station where they're actually seeing a group of people being transported to Poland. And Louise makes the comment, you'd think they would have useful things in their bundles, like something to eat or water or who knows, a flashlight, a knife.
Matchsticks, you said.
Yeah, but what they had was family heirlooms and family photographs. And, at one point, Louise, in her newly learned German, asks one of the guards, well, what's going on here? And the guard says to her, it's only Jews, So part of what you say, the hero's journey, is that sense of understanding how awful everything was. And in researching this book, and looking at the New York Times, for instance, of the day, there were lots of front page stories in the Times about what was happening to Jews, how they were being disenfranchised, stories about them not being able to, after Kristallnacht, not being able to go to universities, not being able to be members of the German sort of AAA, whatever it was called then, the Road Club. And so, this gradual disenfranchisement was going on until it got to, people losing their lives. It was known. People weren't really paying attention to it. And Ida and Louise got like a first-hand look, and this again is all before 1939, all before September 1939 when the Second World War breaks, where they're seeing what's going on with people, and they're talking to these people they become lifelong friends with, and one of the things that happens, and one of the things that people wrote to Yad Vashem about was that their help did not stop with them bringing these people to safety in London, that it continued, and sometimes for years at a time, because people couldn't get jobs, they couldn't find apartments. I recently found a relative of one of the people they saved in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he said his aunt, who was very wealthy and from Frankfurt, and was saved by the Cook sisters, just couldn't deal with what had happened to her because of the Nazis coming to power. She was a medical student who was no longer able to study. She was engaged to a man who was killed in front of her. She comes to New York City during the war. She goes to England first and then to New York. Ida and Louise immediately ask their opera world connections to find her a place to live, to find her a job, and then she ends up working at Columbia University in the photo research department for years, and then afterwards becomes a bag lady. I mean, according to her nephew, who I spoke to a couple of weeks ago. But they never stopped talking to these people. They never stopped helping them. And after the war, they went to displaced persons camps and continued to help people. So their journey went from not ever having met a Jew to really understanding firsthand what was going on and realizing how urgent their help was needed.
And in the midst of saving 29 people, right?
Yeah.
So 29 people, and then one of them, was it Ida or Louise that learned German, and a second Louise?
It was Louise, yeah.
Louise learns German. They get the sort of underground flat in Dolphin Square. They go to America at least twice, if not more times, right?
Yes.
And then in the middle, and they're smuggling furs and Jews in front of the black guards, risking their lives. And then also in the middle of all this, Ida writes 200 romance novels.
Well, yeah, she writes it from about 1936 until like the 1980s.
How did she have the time, Isabel?
Oh my God,
this?
she was a prolific writer. She would just
like
go.
Isabel is too, though. She really is.
I haven't written 200 romance songs. And you can look your nose down at the Harlequin romances she wrote, but I actually read a lot of them and they were good. Like
you read them?
Yeah, the structure was
wow.
in like some of them I couldn't put down. Like they're all very chaste. And then she's got a whole series. She's got a series of 13 books about a famous conductor and the love affairs of the famous conductor. And of course that conductor is Clemens Krauss. One of the people I spoke to who knew the sisters said they both had this crush on Clemens Krauss, who was this really imperious, charismatic. Somebody asked for his autograph once, and he signed Georges Bizet, obviously not his name. And
was he a double agent or no? He wasn't, right?
No, but he suffered after the war because, if he's guilty of anything, it's being really ambitious. And you spoke earlier about opera and the Third Reich and how what intrigue there was in that world. So a lot of opera conductors who were against the Nazis lost their jobs, or if they were Jewish, obviously they lost their jobs, or left. And Clemens Krauss was only too happy to take over these jobs that nobody wanted anymore because of his own background. I mean, he was, for want of a better expression, an illegitimate child. His mother was 15 when he was born. From a wealthy family, but still struggled. And so he was going to take advantage of every situation. And he was hated by, sort of the conductor class. And this worked against him after the war. He was never a member of the Nazi Party, but he moved in those circles and took advantage of those circles. But then he was also risking his life, asking these two women to help him save all of these Jews. So a very complex hero. In the same way that Oskar Schindler, a war profiteer, made money off of the people that he was employing as slave labor, and saved many more people. But still, for me, also Clemens Krauss was one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, because what a character.
Who plays him in the movie, do you think?
Oh, I don't know.
Quick, no?
You know more about.
I don't. Well, there's one more. We want to open it up to questions in a bit, but there's another jarring, unusual thing in this book, which is the thread of the paranormal runs through it, and it starts with the Cook sisters' mother, and I love they're totally the matter-of-fact English type, but the mother, and then we'll talk about the mother, and then tell us at the very end, how this sort of belief in the paranormal followed them throughout their lives.
So there's a very odd situation at the beginning of their lives where their mother talks about seeing the ghost that lives in their home. And it's very rational conversation about the ghost and the mother asking the ghost why he's hanging around and saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, it must have been such a painful experience." And the ghost says to her, "You've got it wrong. I'm not the victim, I'm the murderer." And so this is something that stays with them their whole lives, this belief in ghosts, so much so that they become aficionados of a man named Leslie Flint, a medium who held seances in London. And so they would go to these seances because they believed people, and this was after one of their nieces died of leukemia, I'm thinking in the 1940s or so. They wanted to reach her in the other world. And then they would bring their friends to reach people that, who had died, and with all seriousness. And there are actually tapes online of conversations with the medium and Ida and Louise, talking to Clemens Krauss and their dead divas, their beloved divas, Amelita Galli-Curci. They have conversations with Mozart. I know it sounds crazy, but this was a thing. Like, people were really into seances at that time. And I called up the Leslie Flint Society in London, and they were like thrilled to talk to me. And, you know, they knew all about Ida and Louise. They have a whole library there. You know, I don't know. I mean, they certainly believed it. And remember, their world, their inner world was all about the melodrama of opera, the risks they took in helping people during the war, and the romance novels that Ida wrote in conjunction with Louise, by the way. They worked on the stories together. So, I mean, it's just another piece of how fascinating they were.
Isabel, you probably won't like this question, but I have to ask it, which is, when you think back about how these two sisters somehow entered your consciousness, do you think there was anything from the other worlds that drew you to this? And I want you to think before you
No, I don't have to think. Okay. So often when I've written a book, you know, I don't know that I go that far, but I remember writing a book so I wrote this book about these Jewish women who were trafficked, became prostitutes, these poor Jewish women from the shtetls of Poland and Russia. In the 19th and early 20th centuries were trafficked to Brazil and Argentina to be prostitutes, and they were Jewish, and they weren't allowed to really be Jewish because the Jewish community wanted nothing to do with them. They were unclean, and the rest of society obviously wanted nothing to do with them. So they built their own. They pooled their money and started a burial society, and so they became Jewish in death. And it was very moving to me that the last, you know, the last sort of president of what they called the Society of Truth, a woman named Rebecca Friedman, sort of devotes her life to cleansing the bodies of her dead sisters, performing the Tahara ceremony, like just before burial. And I was like really moved by that, and I really wanted to tell her story. Now, whether this was somebody like whose story had been forgotten and they were coming to me to tell it, but I felt very strongly about that. And with Ida and Louise, yeah, I felt that I needed to tell this story. Now, whether you want to like bring the supernatural into it, you know, maybe.
I do. Yeah, why not?
Yeah, because I mean, again, at the beginning, I mentioned that my publisher on my last book was like, "You'll never be able to tell this story." Louise Cook burned her archive, and I'm like, "Oh no, I'm sure there's a way to do it." And I really took a risk there because I didn't know what I was going to do at that time, but I just kept doing it, and I was really moved and grateful to be able to do it, as I was with the Jewish women. Like, to tell, again, marginalized women who fell through history somehow, and we all forgot about them, or were treated as footnotes in history when what they did was so great. I mean, in Rio de Janeiro, these prostitutes start their own synagogue. Now, I don't know anywhere in the world where a group of women start a synagogue. And hold on to it for a number of years. They had an accountant. They had, you know, they were like an LLC. They paid their taxes. I mean, this was really moving to me, as was, you know, the heroism of Ida and Louise. Like, not really thinking it through, but just, this is what we need to do to help people, and not thinking, oh, this is dangerous. Although there were times they were really scared, for sure. So I don't know if that answers your question, Dana.
It did answer my question. Do you want to open it up to questions from the audience?
The jewels and the furs. You talked about how the jewels and the furs got out, but you haven't talked about how the opera singers, the Jewish opera singers, got out. And I know, having just watched the Ken Burns
documentary
of the Holocaust in the U.S., that, you know, there's a point up to which Jews can leave, and then there's a point after which they can't. And so perhaps you could just talk a little bit about how the actual refugees did get out.
Right. So in a lot of cases, the Cooks are working with people who have quota numbers for the United States, and you know, the U.S. wasn't letting a lot of people in. Neither was any other country. I mean, if you study the Evian Conference of 1938, in which all these countries get together about what to do about, you know, the millions of Jews who are stuck in the Third Reich, the only country that stands up and says, I'll take Jews is the Dominican Republic. And then they'll only take them if they have cash. Well, that wasn't going to happen back then. So Ida and Louise, so these people who did have quota numbers for the United States, in some cases the quota numbers would not be available for a couple of years, and it was too dangerous for them to stay in Austria or Germany. So Ida and Louise would get them to England, and they would get them in on various ways, guarantees, like Ida would speak before these congregations and try to get the congregation to chip in for a guarantee for one person to live in Scotland. And you had to guarantee everything, food, lodging. The other way they got them in was through student visas in England or domestic visas, and which meant that a wealthy Austrian all of a sudden had to work as a butler or a maid, and that in England, and often that didn't go over so well. But they got out. The other way with children was Kindertransport. Up until the very beginning, like just before the beginning of the war, a ton of kids were able to leave Austria and Germany on their own through Kindertransports. And in one case, one of the children that they saved, the family in London who looked after the child while the parents were making their way to England, they didn't want to give the child up. They're like, okay, and so they had to intervene to get the child back. So all these pitfalls, even within the, we're going to save you. But that's how they did it. A lot of people ended up, the people who didn't have the quota numbers for the United States, they ended up staying in England. And a lot of them made their lives there, and they weren't easy lives. Like, a lot of them lived in poverty. And again, there was Ida and Louise helping them out.
Families too, or just?
Yes, so in some cases, when we're talking about 29 people, it was the families as well.
How did they fund this huge operation?
So Ida's royalties from her early books, and then Ida would give speeches across London, and she would prevailed upon her friends as well. She said, I need a guarantee for somebody coming out of Austria, can you do it? I mean, at one point, her brother hands over his post office savings account, in the days when you can have a post office savings account, and says, will this help? A lot of their friends pitched in by, one friend stopped smoking and gave Ida and Louise the saved money for postage for all of the applications. I mean, it was really sort of a grassroots effort. And then Ida would just go to these church groups and say, you guys got to get it together and just at least sponsor one person. And it was a lot of luck too, because Ida talks about being at lunch with a friend and talking about their rescue mission, and a woman at the other table overhearing what they were saying and saying, I will help you bring somebody over from Austria. Yes, Louise did. And Louise was a lifelong civil servant. She was a typist in the law courts. And very happy to do that. I mean, they really, they were very bright. Like, I got their, I was lucky enough to find their school records. They went to school in Alnwick in Northumberland. And Alnwick is probably known to us as the place where they filmed the Harry Potter films, in that castle. So that's where they went to school most of their lives. And their report cards were really good. I mean, they had a really kind of brilliant education, and then took the civil service exams. And I think Ida scored the highest in the whole country on her civil service exam. So they were really smart. Yes, sir?
In your research, you mentioned that you were not the question of whether they were spies remains unanswered. Was there anything else that you were not able to answer that you wish you had an answer to?
I wish I knew the identity of all of the people they saved, because the Yad Vashem files have, I don't know, maybe 20 people, 20 letters, and then there are addresses of other people that they reached out to, and I reached out to all of those addresses. I did reverse directories. I looked at census records, anything you can think of to try to find where those people were. They were scattered all over the world. That was part of the problem. Some people ended up in Brazil. Other people went to Ecuador. A lot of them ended up in New York and New Jersey. And, I just, out of the blue, I had called this one man, Lauren Bosch, whose sister or whose aunt, Lisa Bosch, was one of the people they'd saved. I'd called him 5 years ago, and I never got a return phone call, but then I thought, oh, gee, I should just try him again. And he answered the phone and, was able to tell the whole story. And what the interesting story he told was that the brother of Lisa Bosch, so another person the Cook saved, Frederick, was his father. And as soon as Pearl Harbor happened, Frederick went to enlist in the Army on the U.S. side, and he went into the recruiting office and said, I want to drive a tank through Berlin. I mean, with his German accent in English, and ends up back in Germany and becomes a translator for sort of the high command, the U.S. high command, and becomes a translator for the monuments men, the people who saved a lot of the treasures that the Nazis had stolen. So I was really fortunate to be able to speak to him just a few weeks ago. But I don't know if I answered your question. Okay. DNA? Yeah. I guess so. I hadn't thought. That's a good idea that I did not think of. I'm not used to thinking like that. I'm more used to thinking like what's in the documentation, like what are the letters. But that's a fascinating idea. Thank you. You don't watch enough forensic files. I don't. I don't watch TV. I mean, one other thing I want to add is that, again, to your questions about why they did it and stuff, these were women who were brought up in the same generation as Queen Elizabeth II. In fact, when she died, we all talked about a lifetime of service. Well, the Cooks really believed in that sense of service, and there are letters that Ida writes to Rosa Poncell during the coronation, of Elizabeth, when she goes out into the street, in the pouring rain, and is so happy to be there. They were really devoted to their queen and to their country, and, I know it sounds kind of crazy, but this is who they were. And I was reminded a great deal of that during, the lead up to the funeral and then the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II.
Where do we stand on the movie adaptation? Because there is something going on. I know everyone knows how difficult it is to actually bring a movie adaptation of a book to the screen, but this does seem like a natural, and there's something going on, right?
So we have, I don't know if you all remember the Merchant Ivory films, Remains of the Day. So the former president of Merchant Ivory, Donald Rosenfeld, is the producer on what I hope will be a film about Ida and Louise, and the script is done. It's good. It's based on my book, sort of, but it's fiction. I mean, I just hear Ida at the back of my head saying, in her letter to Josh Logan, saying, well, we're not really happy that it's a fictional story on a true theme, and then the film never got made because she was so annoyed with how they were changing their whole lives, because Josh Logan wanted a romance, and he created a romance between the conductor and one of the sisters, which didn't happen in real life. Again, back to your point, they weren't glamorous women. They were, and that's part of the reason I think there was never a Hollywood film.
But I believe when they were talking about the movie, they were talking about Emma Thompson and Cate Blanchett. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah, you really read that New Yorker article, didn't you?
I do my research.
I forgot about that. Yeah, that's right.
But they would be perfect, wouldn't they? I mean...
Yeah, so fingers crossed.
Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, yeah.
She could segue right into this without a problem.
Yeah, so... Yes?
Thank you. Does the script for your fulfillment have a romance?
Now you're asking me. Now I don't remember. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It's simply about them, and it really plays up their plainness. Like at one point, I thought it was brilliant that Ida makes enough money to buy braces. I mean, this didn't happen in real life, but it sort of, adds to who they were, because again, they use that to their advantage. Although there's a great scene where one of the things Clemens Krauss, the conductor, told them to do was you hide in plain sight. So try to go to the hotels frequented by the Nazi high command. And they do. And they, at one of the places at breakfast, they see von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister. And the comment from Ida is, he gave Louise the glad eye. It's just like he's flirting with Louise, and they're like, cringing about it. So, I mean, Louise was very tall and blonde and very Aryan looking, I guess. So maybe not so plain to a Nazi. I don't.
Was it Louise that you said was actually in love, desperately in love with one of the opera?
They were both in love with Clemens Krauss. That's what people who knew them or who still alive. But that's
sort of the love aspect. I mean, it's unrequited and everything. But
totally. They were like, they just thought he was the greatest thing in the world, and he was certainly a character, like very imperious, and they were madly in love with him.
Did they write about that in any of their own little journals?
No, but one of the most interesting scenes, like just before, so Krauss goes through this denazification trial, and he's pilloried after the war as a Nazi. Like every time he's banned from conducting in his beloved Austria. He has to do these gigs around the world, and people, march outside with signs yelling that he's a Nazi, and on one occasion before he dies, he goes to see Ida and Louise at their little flat. And Ida and Louise haven't seen him and his wife, who's also a brilliant soprano, Viorica Ursulak. They haven't seen him since the war. And they find out that their apartment had been destroyed in Munich. They really had nowhere to live. And so Ida gives him the key to their flat in Dolphin Square, saying you can come whenever you need a place to stay. And there's this great scene where they're playing records like they do for the other fans. And Krauss says to them, I've never heard Rosa Ponsell sing. And Ida and Louise can't quite believe that, so they put on one of her records. And Krauss stands up and starts to, with an imaginary baton, and starts to conduct Ponsell, who's, obviously not in the room, but it's just her voice, and then says, oh, that's the most beautiful voice I've ever heard. And then he signs one of his records of tone poems to them, and he signs it to Ida and Louise, to my best friends, Ida and Louise, with love. And they can't get over that. Like, they write about it to letters to Rosa Ponsell. Can you believe it? With love. He must have had a premonition that he would die and he would never see us again. But of course, they saw him again in their, their Leslie Flint seances, and they talked to him. They really believed that. So I had to dig into that, and I found it very interesting.
And when Ida died, Louise didn't know how to even put the gramophone. She couldn't even do them. She didn't know how to do a lot of stuff, and so
the younger sister dies first, and then the older sister is totally lost without her. And I'm giving it away, but okay. She can't turn on the stove. People come and say, we'll help you figure this out. She can't turn on the record player. And she says to the person who says, I'll help you, Louise. We'll figure out how to turn on the record player. And she says, no, I don't need to. I have all the music in my head. And that's the story. Anyway, thank you. Thank you.